He's a former teacher in the state who spoke up about DEI training and was disciplined for his comments. We talked to John Grande about his fight with his school union who refused to help him and the state. Plus, we take a look at other stories making the headlines from around the region. This is Connecticut East This Week. Hello, I'm Brian Scott Smith. Unions are often seen as the bridge between employers and employees when disputes arise or contract negotiations are needed. And in general, unions do a good job in helping to reach compromises between both. But in 2024, a Hartford teacher was disciplined for his comments during DEI training he was undertaking. And when he went to his union, the Hartford Federation of Teachers, they refused to take up his case to arbitration because he was no longer a union member, despite the fact they were the only authority capable of dealing with the matter for him. The Connecticut Labor Board agreed the union had discriminated against Grande, and not only did he win that case against the union, but he is also taking the matter to a higher court. Here's our interview with John Grande and his lawyer Nathan McGrath of the Fairness Center. John, this is about you. We're going to be talking about your story, a former PT teacher here in the state of Connecticut. Tell us about what happened to you and why we're talking to you now.
Back in the fall of 2020, the teacher, I and other teachers had to attend this training during a professional day, and the training was entitled Identity and Privilege. And during this training, there were a couple of activities. One of the activities was to answer a series of questions under certain categories, like race, gender, sexual preference, religion. And if you can answer yes to any of the questions, you were to fill on a pie chart, and it would suggest that you would have privilege. And when I started reading through these questions, I'm like, these are gaslighting questions here, and they were targeting a certain class of people here. The second part of the activity was to be broken up into small groups on Zoom, and we were to discuss how it felt to engage in that activity. So I believe I was the senior teacher in the group, and there was about a group of 9. And I opened up with the meeting and I said, I just got man bashed and white shamed. And somebody else chimed in with, I've worked hard for everything I got in my life, and I don't need to apologize for anything. And a few people said some things. Towards the end, when I left, I stated, I'm just not going to buy into this white bashing BS. And that's what I actually said, was those 2 letters, BS. Now, a couple weeks go by, and I get tipped off on an email that was sent out to everybody in the breakout session but me. Although my name wasn't mentioned, they were identifying a colleague as being inappropriate, hostile, aggressive, and creating an unsafe environment. About 3 months after the actual professional development, I received notification from school officials telling me I was the subject of a investigation for employee misconduct. And that's when the witch hunt really began. Later on that year, I had a pre-disciplinary hearing, which ended up being nothing more than a kangaroo court. I was ultimately reprimanded by receiving a written reprimand placed in my personnel file. This was the first time in my career of teaching, which is 36 years total, where I received something like that. I was ordered to take sensitivity awareness training, and I was threatened with termination should this happen again. So at that point, I had filed a grievance with the teachers union, and it's a 3-step process. The third step is arbitration. Now, clearly, the kangaroo court was still in progress when I had my grievance hearing. And no surprise that I lost the grievance hearing. So I wanted to go to arbitration, because in arbitration, you're now taking the power away from Hartford and you're putting it in the hands of an independent third party. And I was informed by the union, because I had left the union in 2018. I was a member for 29 years. And when the Janus decision came out, that was my opportunity to leave and just get my money back. So I chose to do that. According to the union, I wasn't eligible for arbitration because I was a non-dues paying member, which was illegal. That's how I got hooked up with the Fairness Center, and we filed a complaint with the state labor board, and the labor board sided with me, calling their actions wholly frivolous. And they ordered them to pay attorney's fees to stop discriminating, and they had to post a decision for 60 days. And now what the Fairness Center has done is taken it a step further because one entity was held accountable. Now the Hartford school system, I'm looking to hold accountable for what they did and the way they ran this investigation. So through the Fairness Center, we filed a First Amendment free speech, violation of a free speech case against them. And right now we're waiting for the judge to survive summary judgment.
We'll talk about that in just a moment. I just want, for the sake of the listeners, you mentioned the Janus decision. If I'm reading the correct thing here, it was a landmark decision of the US Supreme Court on US labor law concerning the power of labor unions to collect fees from non-union members. I just wanted to put that in so people understand why you've mentioned it. And also, of course, you're mentioning as well that you stopped being a union member. So we get some context here as well, because of the other comments that you've said, is that then, and Nathan can obviously help us here, you were let down by the union, John. They basically didn't want to support you. But Nathan, that wasn't acceptable, was it?
No, and I think an interesting point here is even though John resigned his union membership, he was in a workplace where the union was the sole representative. So even though he didn't want to be a union member anymore, he still had to accept union representation on terms and conditions of employment, on disciplinary matters. And he wasn't allowed to speak to his employer on any of these things on his own anyway. And that's why the union has an obligation to represent him fairly, even though he's a non-member, because they still hold all the cards. They have all the power. As John said, they're the ones that would decide whether to take it to a neutral arbitrator, like the third step in the process. That's why it's really important to understand the union still was very much in control of this. And that's why, like John said, we filed the labor board charge for him. And that's why the Connecticut State Labor Board said, nope, union, we've given you great power. And we've also now given you a lot of responsibility because you are the only one that can do this on his behalf. And that's why they sided with John at the end of the day.
John, getting back to the survey and everything, obviously it's a few years ago now, but it's still very much an active situation. How did you feel about the whole thing when it all started to really kick off? Because you answered a question I was going to ask you of, had you ever been in trouble before? Had anybody ever said anything? Were you a model employee? You've suggested that you were in fact a good employee and this was the first time something like this had come up. So how did that make you feel?
With the actual training, at the time, I was in my 32nd year in Hartford, and I have these facilitators, these administrators or directors pushing this training on us, telling us, okay, if you take this training, you can relate to your kids better. I was relating to them very well for 32 years, and these facilitators were never teachers in Hartford. And the majority were never teachers, period. So one, it's pretty arrogant on their part to go ahead and push this training on us to say, because I'm a straight Christian white male, I can't relate to my kids. They're really trying to shame that. And as far as them targeting me, I'm really not surprised. In Hartford, they've made it very clear that under this regime, freedom of speech is a privilege. It's not a right. And with them and probably any other school system that's run by a regime, it becomes a privilege. That's why part of what I wrote in the op-ed, talks about the unions and state officials who filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration for withholding federal funding if they continue with DEI in schools. And they're saying that it'll chill speech. My speech was chilled to the point where it grew icicles. Nobody came to my side. So they're talking out of both sides of their mouth.
And again, just for the sake of the listeners, you mentioned that you wrote an op-ed that was for The Hill, a well-known publication. What sort of reaction did you get once you wrote that op-ed?
None of the people that I really know, I think, followed The Hill. The handful of people that I sent it to basically just said, hey, that was well written. But during the comments, I was provided with some of the comments. It was some good, some bad. I'm not sure if everybody really understands the whole situation. So I think they thumb through it and then come up with a comment. But anything that I've written, any interviews I've had, I've gotten pretty good support.
I'm just curious, where do you stand on DEI training?
It has no place in public education at all.
Expand on that a little bit for us. I'm just curious. As we said, this is what this whole thing is about. When you say that, what is it that you don't like about how it is pushed?
You're targeting certain classes by saying these kids can't learn from you because you're a certain color or you're a certain gender or you're a certain religion. I would answer that question by actually asking the question, how does it help? How does DEI actually help kids learn academically? That's never been explained to me. I've always heard this phrase, and Harvard uses it a lot, and it's diversity is our strength. I'm not sure if you've ever heard that. I've heard it, I've seen it written, and I'm like, our diversity is our strength, but nobody's ever explained that to me. What does that mean? What's your measurement of strength? In Harvard, it's certainly not the test scores because they're pretty much at rock bottom. When I make comparisons, I like to use athletics and sports to make a comparison to make my point. And let's say if I was tasked with putting together, let's say being a PE teacher, okay, they want me to put together a baseball team, but it has to be a diverse baseball team. Okay, I have a couple of white kids, a couple of black kids, a couple of Hispanics, a couple of Asians, some trans, a couple of gay kids, girls. Would you not say that's a diverse team? Mm-hmm. Most people would. However, what's the measurement of my strength? Is it the diversity or is it my win-loss record or the talent exhibited on the field? Again, it's a bunch of words that really mean nothing. That's how I view it.
And what sort of reactions did you get from any of your teacher colleagues when this all kicked off?
Well, Harvard has a history of intimidation, but a lot of the teachers, the ones at least that I associate with, they don't like any of this stuff. Will they stand up and say something? Probably not. And I can understand why they do. There's no doubt in my mind that they're going to be targeted. I just wish that people that were, let's say, former Harvard teachers, whether you're retired or whether you're had leave, just come forward and tell your story. I really fought the battle while I was still there. I can fight it. I'm continuing fighting it now, but not everybody's really going to step forward. And like I said, they really attacked me, and now I'm like on the attack myself.
And what about your students as well? Did you ever get any comments or anything from any of your students about this whole thing? Because students do look up to their teachers.
Nothing from my students. And I finished my last 6 years in an elementary school, so pre-K through 5. They're not going to get into stuff like this. Maybe the high school kids, but my career was mostly K-8 or elementary. And kids, when they show up for class, they don't see the teacher's color. They don't see their gender. They see their teacher, just like the teachers don't see their color. They're pretty innocent. They come in, and you're not there to teach them that stuff. You're there to teach academics. They came to the gym. I was in there to get them moving, teach them skills, teach them sport, work on their fitness. That was my role, and that's what we did. Race, gender, that doesn't come into play, and the kids don't see it either, unless you're going to teach it to them.
Nathan, let's pick up with you on this a little bit more. As John said, obviously the DEI training, the situation with the Trump administration, etc. They're sensitive issues, they're complex issues. Talk us through some of the challenges when dealing with a situation like this, because obviously there's multiple viewpoints. There's not necessarily any one correct viewpoint on these things, but how do you deal with these challenges?
I think that John's federal lawsuit that he now is participating in is really hitting at the heart of this, which is, in this situation, DEI, but it could really be any issue where you are speaking your mind and you're stating an opinion on a issue of real social impact and consequence that's in the news regularly and people are regularly talking about it. And the claims in his case are that he was retaliated against for basically stating his opinion, and that he was forced into compelled speech because they basically were okay if people agreed with them on this issue, but he was the one that kind of stepped out of line. And then he went through what he talked about, the year-long investigation, the sensitivity training, the letter in his file. And I think his lawsuit, again, in this situation, DEI, but take your pick of social issues of the day, whether it's foreign policy or abortion or whatever. It's really defending people having the ability to state their opinion and not be retaliated against for it. To me, that's what academics is supposed to be about, the exchange of ideas and forming an opinion, those types of things. That's really what is at the heart of this lawsuit, protecting First Amendment rights.
And of course, the case of Grande versus Hartford Federation of Teachers, which was won. The Labour Board came down on John's side and said no to the union. It was obviously the success that you were looking for. John, how do you think it's helped you to progress further now?
It's a wait and see to see what the court says I have for a case. I'm like I said, I'm retired now. I don't really have to deal with that stuff, but the other teachers do still have to, because it's still being taught, so to speak, in professional developments in the school. But getting back to how does DEI help? In Harvard, they have this program, this grading program, and it's equity-based grading. And it refers to the minimum 50 rule. And what that says is teachers can't give kids less than a 50. So literally, if a kid doesn't show up for 3/4 of the year or do any work, they can still get enough credit to either pass to the next grade or graduate. And this rule, they've been called out on this. And there's actually a current lawsuit that was filed by a former student, a young lady who graduated and couldn't read. And that was filed back in December. And I believe they just stated a number of 3 million for what they're looking for. So again, this is all based on equity. Again, how does that help students achieve academically? How does that prepare them for the future? Harvard is constantly bragging about their district model of excellence, which went into effect in 2018. And their mission is to prepare all students to meet success in and beyond school. How are you going to meet success if people are just handing you grades? You don't learn how to be accountable. You don't learn how to find a way to work through obstacles to succeed. And their vision is to graduate ready to transform the world. In what way? Obviously not a good way, because they're sending out kids that can't read, do basic math, or even think for themselves. That'll transform our world, but not in the way that's good.
Nathan, let's quickly pick up on the federal lawsuit that Grande versus Hartford Board of Education is before the U.S. District Court for the District of Connecticut. Where does it roughly stand? Because it's been filed for a little while now.
So right now we're at a stage where we've conducted some discovery, we've gotten some documents, we've been able to do some depositions, and the matter is before the court right now. It's at an early stage where the court can decide there's enough here to go forward, or there's actually really no claim here and we're going to end the case here. It's called a motions for summary judgment is the stage that it's at right now. So if the court decides that there is enough for a claim here, then John's matter gets to go forward and presumably to trial. And then if not, the court would say, no, it's not going to go any further. And then John gets to make a decision on whether he wants to appeal that or not. So we're in the wait and see mode for the next couple months, I would think.
And should you be successful with this particular case, just give us a sense of what that would actually mean in real world terms.
I think this case would do much like what John's case before the Labor Board did, which that case set a statewide precedent because the board had never stated explicitly in an opinion that the union has the duty to fairly represent members and non-members, which gave now public employees in Connecticut something to actually latch onto and look at and be on their side if they choose to do that. But I think this case would, again, stand a little bit for a beacon of hope for those who do want to speak their mind and have a different opinion, because it's, again, pushing back on parties that are used to basically just trampling over people's rights. And John has had the backbone to stand up and to say, no, you know what, I get to have an opinion. I get to have constitutional rights here. I'm going to defend them. And so I think it would be a significant victory in that sense, not just for John, but others being able to look at it and say, oh, maybe I can have an opinion too.
We've seen in the state of Connecticut recently unions standing up for workers at Pratt and Whitney. We've seen them standing up and succeeding for workers at Electric Boat and nurses unions, etc. So my question to you, John, is if you ever did get back into an employment situation and there was a union there, would you be like a little bit reticent joining a union in the future?
No, I want to be clear. I'm not anti-union at all. I was heavily involved in my union when I was a member, but when I realized that the union was not, and to be fair, it's not the current membership that I filed against, but left before these guys came in, but they were not representing the teachers very well. We were getting lousy contracts. And I'm like, why am I paying $1,000 a year for this when there's surrounding towns that are making way more than I am and working a shorter day. It would not stop me. I have friends that are outside of teachers' unions that would have unions. They get some pretty good stuff. So that would not stop me from joining a union should I, let's say, jump into another career. No.
You've had success so far, obviously, with the first court case and the Connecticut Labour Board. We will keep an eye out for what happens with this. But in the meantime, thank you for continuing to tell your story. I'm sure you're probably exhausted from keep mentioning it. But like everything, I'm afraid we live in a world where we have to keep drip feeding this because people's attention spans are somewhat short. We appreciate you coming onto the podcast and sharing with us your views and opinions about the situation that you were faced with and why you decided to step up and do what you've done. Nathan, thank you as well for giving us a little bit of a legal insight into this as well. To you both, thank you for joining us on the podcast and for sharing this very important story.
Appreciate you having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
You said you'd never buy your kid candy from the checkout aisle or forget extra diapers. You'd never lick your thumb to clean their face. Never, ever become a minivan mom. So when you say you'd never leave your child in a hot car, know it can happen. Cars get hot fast, and kids can be at risk in temperatures as low as 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Never happens. Before you leave the car, always stop, look, lock. Brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
Time now for a look at other stories making the headlines this week. The Connecticut Port Authority and Kiewit Corporation are heading to mediation to try and end a dispute between them over $35 million Kiewit is claiming in outstanding costs and work they carried out to State Pier in New London. During a regular Board of Directors meeting recently, the Port Authority's Executive Director, Michael O'Connor, said they are putting together a mediation plan.
We have our legal counsel developing the mediation plan right now. And then we would set about jointly between us and the contractors selecting a mediator and then seeing what we could do in mediation over less than a 2-week period of time to see if we can find a middle ground on what they're looking for compared to what they provided with us.
Two major issues in the dispute are the stability of soil fill in what is called a transit corridor at the pier and a tow wall the CPA says has been built incorrectly and could damage vessels mooring against it during bad weather. Also on the agenda was the State Pier's future, and O'Connor said they need to be looking longer term beyond just offshore wind.
It'd be good if we were diversified. We've seen some wind hiccups as the administration changed over the course of the beginning of the year. If we had two entities at the State Pier and wind paused, then the other entity can make use of the space. And if the other entity paused, wind could make use of the space. So I think there's an opportunity here to talk to everybody about what that looks like and see what can be gained on multi-use at the State Pier.
The controversial pier has cost the state of Connecticut over $311 million and was redeveloped exclusively for the offshore wind industry, which was booming under the Biden administration. However, the Trump administration has since pulled back on offshore wind and other clean energy projects. An historic building in downtown Norwich that was built in 1888 and has been shuttered for the last 30 years has been given a new lease on life. The former Reed & Hughes department store on Main Street has been turned into 17 market-rate apartments and a retail space. David McCarthy is from Heritage Housing, the developer for the project, and said rehabbing old buildings like this is costly and time-consuming, but important.
The reason to do it as a city and to spend so much of your city's time on something like this is that your downtown is just so important to your city's livelihood. Your downtown is really the heartbeat of your city, and bringing a building like Reed & Hughes back to life just helps encourage that livelihood of the city to continue to expand and grow.
Peter Nystrom is the mayor of Norwich and said it's a project the entire city wanted to see happen.
In some respects, it was a mountain to move this building forward. Its biggest obstacle was it's so small, and the cost per square foot for development, the way things are going up, made it almost cost prohibitive. But today it's done. I hope you appreciate it. I hope you recognize the beautiful facade outside, because that's what people saw when this building first opened. History is still alive. We keep our bones here in this community. We value the historic housing and structures.
The redevelopment of the building was supported by a $550,000 state grant approved by Governor Lamont in 2022 through the state's Community Investment Fund. The town of Nantucket in Massachusetts has agreed to a $10.5 million settlement with GE Vernova, who make offshore wind turbine blades. The agreement comes after one of the blades, part of the Vineyard Wind offshore wind farm, failed, scattering thousands of pieces of damaging debris along the town's beaches and coastal waters. Brooke Moore is a select board member of the town of Nantucket and said it was important for them to send a message to the industry.
All along, I have been advocating for this industry to be responsible to communities like Nantucket for the impact we now know they can have upon us. And I believe that this settlement signals to the industry that there is a consequence to these kind of incidents. And my hope is it incentivizes them to do their level best to make sure it doesn't happen again.
The incident happened at the height of the summer season last year, and local businesses that were affected can now apply to a community fund that has been set up with the money to claim for losses they incurred. Greg Werkheiser is from the law firm Cultural Heritage Partners and said the situation isn't over yet for developer Vineyard Wind.
GE Vernova came to the table in good faith, negotiated in good faith, and they deserve to be commended for that. The town will be saying more about its concerns about Vineyard Wind, but suffice it to say that we didn't feel that Vineyard Wind came to the table with enough good faith to be part of the final settlement agreement as a signatory.
Connecticut East This Week reached out to Vineyard Wind for comment on the settlement situation, but has not received any response to our questions. Putnam Police Department has been recognized by the American Legion as the 2024-2025 Police Department of the Year for the entire state of Connecticut. The prestigious award was given to the police department at the American Legion's recent 106th annual convention. The American Legion said the award is given annually to a police department in the state that brings credit to that police department for performance in the field of children and youth, drug education, community awareness projects, and participation in patriotic observances. And a heartwarming story from the Day newspaper. A former bait dog called Bella, a three-legged pit bull, has finally been adopted after spending 1,763 days at the Montville Animal Shelter. Bella was found abandoned in September 2020 and due to her past was a challenge to get adopted, according to the shelter, despite the fact she had no bites on record and had just had a hard life. Finally, a Southington woman saw a posting on social media about Bella and thought she would be a great addition to the three dogs she already owned. And on June 29th, Bella was officially adopted to her new owners. She's the longest stay at the Montville shelter to date. Bella's new owner says she's now enjoying her new loving environment away from kennel stress and enjoying eating hot dogs, her favorite snack. You can read the full story about Bella at theday.com. That's all from us for this edition. Do send us your questions and story ideas to the show via our website at connecticut-east.com or Facebook or Twitter at Connecticut East and on Instagram at Connecticut East This Week. And you can listen to the show again on our social platforms on demand and by asking your smart speaker to play Connecticut East This Week podcast. And please like, follow and share on your social media too. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.